The cold CEO's final deal. The girl he married by contract became his forever. If you believe that love can grow even in the coldest hearts, stay until the end. This story will remind you that sometimes the most unreal beginnings lead to the truest endings. Now, let us return to our main character. The rain hit the glass walls of Cole Enterprises like a relentless symphony, each drop echoing through the empty corridors of the 40th floor. Inside the executive office, Ethan Cole sat behind his desk, the city lights reflecting off the polished surface like fractured stars. He was the kind of man whose silence weighed more than most people's words, a man defined by precision, control, and the chill of success. But that night, even success could not warm him. He read the contract one last time. 6 months, it said. 6 months of pretending, smiling, and keeping up appearances until the board renewed his seat as CEO. A fake marriage to silence investors who questioned his lack of stability. Ethan leaned back, his jaw tightening. Love was a luxury he had buried years ago right beside the woman who once swore she could thaw him. The elevator chimed. The glass doors slid open, and a woman stepped inside, carrying a sketchbook pressed to her chest instead of a purse. Her name was Ava Nguyen. The rain had soaked through her coat, and a strand of hair clung to her cheek. She looked nothing like the polished executives who usually walked these halls. There was something raw, human, and out of place about her. "Mr. Cole?" she asked softly, voice trembling but steady enough to hold its ground. Ethan stood, studying her. He expected arrogance or calculation. Instead, he saw eyes that had known hunger, loss, and quiet endurance. "You are here about the proposal," he said, his tone clipped, distant. Ava nodded, her fingers tightening on the sketchbook. "I read the terms. I just need to make sure it is real." "It is real," he replied, sliding the document toward her. "You will receive full compensation health coverage, housing, and financial support for your brother's surgery. In exchange, you will act as my wife. 6 months. Public appearances. No emotions. No questions." She hesitated. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, filling the silence between two strangers about to gamble their dignity. "You think love can be signed into existence?" she asked quietly. "I think everything has a price," Ethan said, meeting her gaze without flinching. Her lips curved in a faint, tired smile. "Then you have never seen someone fight for life without one." She reached for the pen, the ink gliding across paper like a whisper of surrender. As she signed her name, a gust of wind rattled the window behind her. Ethan watched the movement of her hand, delicate but firm, and something inside him flickered. Not recognition, not attraction, just an unexpected sense that he was making the most human decision of his life. He took a small silver ring from the drawer and placed it on the table. "You will wear this in public. It does not mean anything." Ava picked it up, turning it under the cold light. "Maybe not to you," she said softly. "But to some people, symbols still matter." For a moment, the air between them shifted, two souls unknowingly, standing on the edge of something that neither contract nor logic could define. Outside, the rain softened. The city pulsed with neon light. And inside that office, the deal that began as survival quietly started to feel like destiny. The morning after the contract was signed, sunlight slipped between the tall buildings of downtown Chicago and found its way into Ava's small apartment. The place was barely more than a studio, cluttered with half-finished sketches and a small easel near the window. Her brother's medication bottles lined the counter like quiet reminders of why she had agreed to something so unthinkable. She had promised herself she would never let desperation dictate her life again. Yet here she was, preparing to marry a man she barely knew. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. "Ethan Cole, car will pick you up at 10. Dress appropriately." The words were cold, exact, like everything about him. Ava closed her sketchbook, exhaled slowly, and whispered to herself, "This is for Liam." 2 hours later, the city's chaos faded behind tinted car windows as she was driven through the gates of Cole Manor, a modern mansion of glass and stone overlooking Lake Michigan. Inside, the house was a world of symmetry and silence. Even the air seemed expensive. Ethan waited in the main hall, immaculate in a dark suit. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze lingered a moment longer than before when he saw her. "You will be introduced to the staff," he said evenly. "From now on, you live here. No one outside this house needs to know the details of our agreement." Ava nodded, her heart pounding. Every step she took echoed across marble floors, her reflection fractured in glass walls. It felt less like entering a home, and more like stepping into a contract made of stone. That evening, the lawyer arrived. The marriage was finalized with the sterile efficiency of a business merger. There were no vows, no music, only the quiet scratch of pens, and the official's low voice pronouncing them husband and wife. When it was over, Ethan handed her a keycard instead of flowers. "Your room is down the hall," he said. She tried to smile. "You make marriage sound like an office relocation." "You make marriage sound like an office relocation." He paused, a flicker of something almost human crossing his face. "It is easier that way." Later that night, Ava stood by her window, watching the city lights ripple across the lake. For the first time, she wondered not just what she had agreed to, but who this man truly was when the cameras and contracts fell away. Somewhere behind those walls of control, there had to be a story-some wound that had turned him into ice. Across the hall, Ethan sat in his study, pretending to read reports, but seeing only the look in her eyes when she signed her name. There had been no fear, only resolve. She reminded him of someone he used to be, someone who believed in meaning before numbers. He poured a glass of whiskey and leaned back, staring at the silver ring, now resting on her hand in memory. He had chosen the cheapest one on purpose. Symbols did not matter, he had told himself. Yet the image of her turning it in the light refused to leave his mind. Outside, thunder rolled over the lake. Inside, two strangers lay awake in separate rooms, their thoughts crossing the same silent distance. The deal was done. The roles were set, but neither of them realized that the contract they had written in ink would soon be rewritten by something far stronger, by time, by kindness, and by the simple, stubborn grace of being human. Days turned into a quiet rhythm inside Cole Manor. Every morning began the same way, Ethan leaving before dawn, Ava alone with the silence and the faint scent of his coffee still in the air. She tried to adjust, moving through the mansion like a visitor in a museum where every object was too perfect to touch. The staff treated her with polite curiosity, unsure whether to address her as Mrs. Cole or as the employer's latest arrangement. She spent her mornings sketching near the tall window overlooking the lake. The light there was softer, kinder, and in that stillness, she felt briefly human again. Her drawings changed. They were no longer of strangers or hands or the street corners she once loved to capture. They were of windows and reflections, portraits of someone searching for herself in a place that did not belong to her. One afternoon, she heard the echo of footsteps behind her. Ethan stood a few feet away, his gaze falling on the open sketchbook. "You draw," he said simply. "It helps me remember that I exist," Ava replied, closing it halfway. He studied her for a moment. "Most people draw to be seen, and most people talk to be heard," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. For the first time, he smiled, not wide, but real. Something shifted. The air between them softened, no longer filled, only with obligation. A few days later, he asked her to accompany him to a charity event hosted by the company. The press had been restless since the news of his marriage. Ava hesitated but agreed. It was part of the deal. The dress his assistant had chosen was too elegant for her taste, but when she stepped out of the car under the flashes of cameras, she stood tall. Inside the ballroom, conversation hummed over crystal glasses and piano music. A group of investors approached, curious about the woman who had married the city's most calculating man. One of them, an older executive, gave a thin smile. "You must be quite the actress to convince Ethan Cole to settle down." Ava met his gaze. Maybe he just needed someone who would not act. The words surprised even her. Ethan's expression remained unreadable, but his hand brushed lightly against her back, a silent thank you. As the evening went on, he watched her navigate the crowd with quiet dignity. She did not belong to that world of polished power, yet she carried herself with an ease money could never buy. He realized that while he had hired her to play a role, she was slowly teaching him how to live, one truthfully. When they returned home that night, the house no longer felt as cold. Ava slipped off her shoes and laughed softly. "Your world is exhausting," she said. "It was," Ethan answered, setting down his tie. "Until tonight." They stood in the dim hallway for a long moment, neither sure what came next. The rules they had written in ink, no emotions, no personal questions, suddenly felt fragile. Later, as she sat at her desk, Ava opened her sketchbook again. She drew two figures standing under chandeliers, one sharp-edged and composed, the other warm and uncertain. Between them, a single line of light. She traced it slowly and whispered to herself, "It is not love. Not yet. But maybe it is the start of something honest." In another room, Ethan poured water instead of whiskey for the first time in months. He looked toward her closed door and realized the silence did not feel empty anymore. Something human was taking root inside the coldest house in Chicago. A few weeks later, the seasons began to shift. The leaves along Lakeshore Drive turned the color of brass and wine, and the air carried that quiet chill that made everything feel slower, more deliberate. Inside Cole Manor, something unspoken had changed as well. The routine that once felt like a contract now began to resemble a life. Ava started joining Ethan for breakfast instead of waiting until he left. At first, their conversations were little more than polite exchanges about schedules and meetings. But over time, small things slipped through tiny glimpses of the people behind the titles. One morning, she noticed a framed photograph on the counter that had never been there before. It showed a boy, maybe 12, standing beside an older woman in a garden full of wildflowers. "Your family?" she asked gently. Ethan hesitated. "My mother. She used to say wildflowers are proof that beauty does not need permission." Ava smiled. She was right. He looked at her for a long moment before returning to his coffee. She also said people should never pretend to bloom where they do not belong. I ignored that part. Their eyes met briefly. And in that quiet exchange, something softened again. That weekend, Ethan asked her to attend a private dinner with one of the company's partners. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair loose. The dinner went smoothly until the partner's wife, a sharp-tongued socialite, leaned forward and asked with a smirk, "So, Ava, what did you do before marrying our city's most untouchable man?" "I was an art teacher," Ava said calmly, "and a caretaker, and a woman who still believes work is more about meaning than money." The table fell silent for a heartbeat before Ethan interjected, "Which makes her far more grounded than most of us here." The remark carried weight. Even his partner looked startled. After dinner, as they walked toward the car, Ava exhaled. "You did not have to defend me." "Yes, I did," Ethan said simply. "You are my wife." The word lingered between them, heavier than before. That night, back at the mansion, the power went out during a storm. The house plunged into darkness, and Ava, searching for candles, found Ethan in the study. He was sitting by the window, lit only by lightning flashes over the lake. She handed him a candle and smiled. "Looks like your empire runs on electricity after all." He laughed softly, an unfamiliar sound in that house. It seemed so. When the storm quieted, she found the piano in the living room, covered with dust. She sat down and began to play a gentle tune. Ethan leaned against the doorway, listening. "What is that?" he asked. "A song I wrote after my mother died," she said. "It reminds me that even after loss, there can still be warmth." He stepped closer. "You believe warmth always returns?" "I have to," she said, her fingers still moving across the keys. "Otherwise I would stop drawing, stop breathing." He watched her in silence, and something broke inside the armor he had worn for years. The storm outside faded, but inside, the air trembled with a different kind of electricity, quiet, human, alive. When she finished playing, he whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" "For making this house feel like a home. Even just for one night." Ava looked up, and for the first time since signing that impossible contract, she saw not the CEO, but the man behind him, tired, kind, and quietly lost. She closed the piano lid gently and said, "Then maybe that is what we both needed to find." The candle flickered, the clock ticked softly, and for a moment, two strangers bound by paper began to feel like two souls finding warmth in the middle of winter. The following month arrived with an invitation. Neither of them could avoid the annual Cole Foundation Gala. It was the company's largest event of the year, a place where appearances mattered more than truth. For Ethan, it was a battlefield dressed in velvet. For Ava, it was another test of the strange role she now played. The morning of the event, she stood before the mirror in a gown chosen by Ethan's assistant. It shimmered like liquid bronze under the light. For a moment, she did not recognize the woman staring back. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the small silver ring that still rested on her finger. When Ethan appeared in the doorway, wearing a black tuxedo and that familiar look of quiet restraint, she noticed how his eyes softened when they met hers. "You look perfect," he said simply. "Perfect feels like a costume," Ava replied. He hesitated before answering. "Then let us wear it together." At the gala, chandeliers glowed like captured stars above a crowd of power and wealth. Reporters hovered near the entrance, ready to capture the city's most elusive man with his mysterious wife. Ethan guided her through the crowd, his hand light but steady on her back. Every step they took together felt like an unspoken pact. Whispers followed them. Some admired, others judged. Ava kept her head high, remembering the people she had once taught, the ones who never had a chance to stand in rooms like this. Her presence here was not just for survival anymore. It was proof that kindness and courage could exist even among marble and mirrors. During dinner, one of the board members raised a glass and smiled thinly. "To Ethan's new chapter," he said, "and to the woman who finally managed to tame him." A ripple of laughter moved through the table. Ava felt the sting of the words but forced a polite smile. "No one tames another person," she said gently. "You just remind them what it feels like to be human again." The laughter died instantly. Ethan turned toward her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes holding something fierce: pride, perhaps, or gratitude. Later that night, as the orchestra began to play a slow waltz, Ethan extended a hand. "Dance with me," he said. "I do not know how," she admitted. "Then just follow." They moved together beneath the lights, the crowd blurring into a quiet hum. It was not a perfect dance. She stepped on his shoe once, and he laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. The sound startled her, and she laughed too. For a few fleeting minutes, they were not a CEO and a contract wife. They were two people who had forgotten the rules of their arrangement. When the music ended, the applause faded, and the night slowly dissolved into soft conversation. Ethan leaned closer and whispered, "You were remarkable tonight." Ava looked up at him and said, "You just liked that I did not trip again." "Maybe," he said, smiling. "But mostly, I liked that you were not afraid." As they left the ballroom, the cameras flashed again, freezing that moment of unexpected joy. Neither of them realized that the image of their laughter would spread across every business headline the next morning, turning a deal into a story the whole city would want to believe in. And somewhere deep inside Ethan, a thought began to take root. Maybe this was what real partnership looked like. Not power, not perfection, but two flawed hearts learning how to breathe in the same rhythm. In the weeks following the gala, everything around them seemed to slow down. The noise of business meetings and social expectations faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of two people learning to coexist. For the first time, Ethan stayed home on a Sunday. He found Ava in the backyard garden that had long been neglected, kneeling in the dirt with gloves and a straw hat. The autumn sun painted her skin with soft gold, and her laughter carried across the wind when she discovered the first hint of new green breaking through the soil. He leaned on the patio railing, watching her. "You are turning my property into a farm," he said. "Maybe your house just needed something alive," she replied without looking up. It was a simple moment, but it felt like a beginning. That evening, they shared dinner together in the kitchen instead of the formal dining room. Ava cooked nothing extravagant, just pasta and fresh bread. The air smelled of garlic and thyme, and for once, the house felt like a home. Ethan sat across from her, sleeves rolled up, tie forgotten. "No chef has ever served me a meal like this," he said. "That is because they cook to impress," Ava answered. "I cook to feed." He watched her hands move as she poured tea, noticing how steady they were despite everything she had endured. "You miss teaching, do you not?" "I miss reminding people that art is not about talent," she said softly. "It is about attention. The way you look at something changes what it becomes." That line stayed with him long after the dishes were done. A few nights later, Ava found him in his study surrounded by papers and screens, his face drawn and distant. "You are still awake," she said. "I cannot sleep," he admitted. "There is a deal on the verge of collapse. If it fails, hundreds of employees could lose their jobs." She sat beside him, her voice gentle but firm. "Then stop seeing it as a transaction and start seeing it as people. You lead better when you remember that." Her words pierced through the noise in his head. For the first time, Ethan looked at the graphs and numbers not as assets, but as lives depending on his decision. The next morning, he changed the terms of the deal, cutting profits to protect jobs. The board questioned him, but his answer was simple: because people matter. When he came home that evening, he found Ava sketching by the fire. She had drawn two hands, one gloved in dirt and the other holding a pen. He realized they were theirs. "You are different lately," she said, smiling. "So are you," he replied. Later, as they walked along the lake, she told him about her dream and art exhibit called Hands That Built Home, to honor workers and caregivers whose stories were never seen. "I want people to look at these hands and understand that worth does not come from wealth," she said. Ethan listened, his gaze on the horizon where the water met the fading Sunday. "Then we will make it happen," he said quietly. She turned to him, surprised. "You would support that?" "I think it is time I started investing in something real," he answered. That night, the distance between them felt smaller. They did not speak of contracts or obligations. They just sat in silence, listening to the waves. The air between them carried warmth, fragile but unmistakable. The kind that grows not from passion, but from respect. And for the first time since the beginning, Ava realized she was no longer pretending to be someone's wife. She was simply herself, and that was enough. Winter came early that year. The first snow blanketed the city, softening even the sharpest corners of downtown Chicago. Inside Cole Manor, warmth lingered in small, quiet gestures. An extra cup of coffee poured, a shared silence by the fireplace. But peace, like winter light, never lasts forever. It began with a headline: Cole marriage a fraud. Insider reveals contract scandal. Within hours, the story spread across every business site and news channel. The photographs from the gala, once celebrated as proof of a fairy tale romance, now appeared beside words like deception and corporate manipulation. Ava saw it first. Her phone buzzed with notifications, messages from old colleagues, even her hospital contact asking if the story was true. She turned pale, her fingers trembling as she held the screen. The world that had only just started to accept her now looked at her as a fraud. When Ethan came home that evening, the house felt heavier than ever. She stood in the doorway, holding the printed article. "They know, Ethan," she said quietly. "Someone leaked it." He took the papers from her hand and read them, his expression tightening. "It will blow over," he said. "Blow over?" Her voice broke, filled with disbelief. "They are calling me a liar. They think I sold myself to you for money." His silence was meant to protect her, but it sounded like indifference. She took a step back. "You could deny it. You could tell them the truth." "The truth will destroy the company," he replied. "Thousands of people depend on it. I cannot risk that." Ava stared at him, realizing the distance that had once felt like safety now felt like betrayal. "So my dignity is the price of your empire?" He looked away. "I am trying to protect you." "By erasing me?" she whispered. "You do not get to decide what my life costs." That night, she packed her things. The sketchbook, the silver ring, a few clothes. Before leaving, she placed the ring on his desk beside the contract that had started it all. "You taught me something," she said softly. "People matter more than profit, but maybe you forgot that again." She left before dawn, walking through the snow until her shoes were soaked. Behind her, Cole Manor stood silent, its windows glowing like eyes that refused to sleep. Days turned into weeks. The media frenzy quieted, but the emptiness in Ethan's house did not. He worked longer hours, spoke less, and tried to convince himself that distance was mercy. But every empty chair, every untouched cup of coffee, reminded him of what he had lost. One evening, he found her sketchbook on the shelf. It was open to a half-finished drawing, two hands reaching toward each other, separated by a line of text that read, "Worth is not measured by wealth, but by courage." He closed the book and whispered to the empty room. "You were right, Ava." For the first time, the silence answered back. It was not the silence of success or control, but of loneliness, the kind that forces a man to look at his reflection and see not a CEO, but a human being who had failed the only promise that mattered. Outside, the snow kept falling. Somewhere in the city, Ava was rebuilding her life, not as a contract wife, but as an artist and a woman who still believed in kindness. And Ethan Cole, for all his wealth and walls, was left with the realization that love cannot be negotiated and integrity cannot be replaced. 3 months passed before Ethan saw her name again. It appeared on a modest invitation that arrived with the morning mail. Hands That Built Home, a community art exhibit by Ava Nguyen. The invitation was printed on recycled paper, the kind she used to sketch on. At the bottom was a simple line in her handwriting. "For everyone who believes, dignity never expires." Ethan stared at it for a long time. His company had recovered, the stock had stabilized, and the board had praised his resilience. But the victories felt hollow. The mansion remained quiet, the fireplace unused, and every success came with the taste of regret. That evening, he made a decision that had nothing to do with profit. The exhibit took place in an old community center near the river, far from the marble halls of his world. When he walked in, he blended easily among the guests, artists, teachers, and workers, still wearing their uniforms from the day's shift. The walls were lined with paintings of hands, hands building homes, feeding children, holding fragile dreams together. And then he saw her final piece. Two hands reaching toward one another, drawn in graphite and gold leaf. Beneath it, the inscription read, "For the one who taught me that warmth is not weakness." Ava stood across the room, speaking softly to a group of visitors. She looked different, lighter, freer. The exhaustion that had once shadowed her face was gone. When their eyes met, the noise around them seemed to fade. She did not smile, not yet, but she did not turn away either. Ethan approached slowly, his voice quiet. "It is beautiful, Ava." "Thank you," she said, folding her hands in front of her. "It took time to finish." "I can see that." He paused, searching for the right words. "I owe you an apology, for everything." She looked at him, calm and steady. "You do not owe me an apology. You owe yourself the truth." He nodded, his throat tight. "Then let me start there. The story they told about us, it was wrong. The contract was real, but what came after was not business. It was the only thing that ever felt real." Ava listened in silence. Around them, the crowd moved gently, unaware of the quiet reconciliation happening in the center of the room. "I was afraid," Ethan continued. "Afraid that if I admitted I cared, I would lose control. But I lost you instead." Her eyes softened, but her voice remained composed. "You did not lose me, Ethan. You just had to find yourself first." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the silver ring, now restored and lined with a thin band of gold inside. "I kept it," he said, "not as proof of what we were, but of what I still hope we could be." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she looked around the room, the people, the art, the causes, and smiled faintly. "You came to the right place to begin again." He smiled too, the kind that carried both sorrow and gratitude. "If you will let me, I would like to help expand this exhibit. Fund more artists, more stories like yours." Ava studied him carefully, searching for sincerity. "You would do that?" "I would," he said. "Because people matter. You taught me that." Something in her expression softened completely. "Then maybe this time, we can build something that does not need a contract." Ethan looked at her painting once more, the golden light reflecting off the lines that once separated two hands now meeting at the center. "I would like that," he said quietly. And for the first time in months, she smiled, not the polite smile of duty, but the kind that carries forgiveness. The past did not vanish, but it no longer held them hostage. In that simple, human moment, the man who once believed everything had a price finally understood that the most valuable things in life cannot be bought, only earned through grace. Spring returned with quiet certainty. The city thawed, the trees along the river bloomed again, and the cold steel of winter softened into warmth. For Ethan, those months after the exhibit became a new kind of life. He spent his days rebuilding his company with compassion at its core, and his evenings helping Ava organize her growing art foundation. Together, they transformed that small community gallery into something larger, a network that funded artists, veterans, and single mothers who used creativity to heal. Every project carried her touch. Every speech he gave carried her belief. The empire he once ruled through control now thrived through empathy. Investors began to call him the human CEO, a title that made him smile because it finally felt true. One Saturday morning, Ethan drove to the riverside studio Ava had built. Inside, sunlight filtered through the tall windows, dancing across canvases still drying from fresh paint. Ava stood near the wall, guiding a group of children who were painting their first murals. She laughed easily, her voice light and grounded, and for a moment, Ethan simply watched her. The woman who had once walked into his office, desperate for survival, was now the heartbeat of something much bigger, proof that grace could outgrow pain. When the children left, she turned to him, wiping her hands on a towel. "You look like a man with a secret," she said playfully. He reached into his jacket and handed her a folded piece of paper. "It is not a secret. It is an amendment. She opened it, recognizing the faded outline of the old contract, the same one they had signed on a stormy night months ago. But this time, there was only one clause written in clean ink across the page. Clause 10, love, no expiry. Her eyes lifted to meet his. He took a step closer and held out the silver ring, now fully plated in gold. Marry me again, he said softly. No conditions. No signatures. Just faith. For a long moment, she did not speak. Then she smiled through the tears that gathered at the corner of her eyes. If it is real, you do not need to ask twice. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and sunlight caught its surface, scattering light across the room like fragments of promise. That evening, the foundation hosted a small event at the community garden. The guests were not investors or journalists, but families, teachers, and workers, the very people whose stories had once inspired Ava's art. Ethan stood beside her as she unveiled the final installation. Two sculpted hands joined together, cast from bronze, and engraved with the words, "Home is wherever kindness stays." As the crowd applauded, Ava turned to him and whispered, "We started with paper. We ended with purpose." He smiled, his voice barely above a whisper. "And this time, it will last." The sun dipped below the horizon, turning the river to gold. Around them, laughter and soft music filled the air. They stood hand in hand, not as a contract or a correction, but as two people who had learned that love is not about perfection. It is about persistence, grace, and the courage to begin again. And in that final light of day, the coldest man in Chicago finally understood that warmth was never weakness. It was the truest kind of strength.